The morning after the Queen's death, on September 8th, 2022, newspapers across the world ditched protocol and splashed pictures of Britain's longest reigning monarch across their front pages. The Telegraph led with a quote from the Queen herself after 9/11. "Grief is the price we pay for love," it said. The Daily Mail's header was just as sentimental. "Our hearts are broken," whilst the Sun went for the respectful, "Thank you, ma'am." At the Times, we ran an obituary of unprecedented length and went for the formal headline, "A Life in Service." But we also highlighted the human behind the myth. "It is important to remember," the obituary read, "that beneath the crown there was also a woman, a wife, a mother. Too frequently the human side of her character, her talent for mimicry, her sense of fun, the way she came to life when she was watching her racehorses in action, was overlooked as a nation concentrated instead on the cipher it wanted to see."
Welcome to Last Rites. In this special episode, we're going to look back at what was probably one of the most momentous deaths of our lifetime, that of Queen Elizabeth II. And we're going to take you behind the scenes into what it was like at the newsroom, at the Times. Because, Georgia, you were there on the day the Queen died. Can you tell us a little bit about how that day unfolded? I mean, what was it like to be in the newsroom on the day the Queen died?
So it's a strange day for an obituarist because in many ways it's the day we've all been preparing for. I like to think of it as being a football journalist when England wins the World Cup, which may be a bit insensitive, but this is what we were born to do in some senses. The Queen's death, whether or not you're a royalist and whether or not she meant something to you personally, was a momentous national event, a day of mourning, and we had been preparing for it for decades. I, of course, have only been at the Times for 4 years, but it's always on our radar. So there was a sense when the news broke around midday. For us at the newsroom, it didn't officially break until 6 p.m.
Well, I was going to say, did you get the news before the rest of the sort of general public got the news?
Yeah, and
how does that work?
So I'm going to turn here to my editor, Nigel Farndale, who is the obituaries editor of the Times, and I interviewed him yesterday because he was in the office like me, but because he's the editor and I'm a lowly writer, he was actually there in the news conference. So here's him telling us about what it was like to be in the office.
There was a bit of a strange atmosphere that day because the executive editor, Jeremy Griffin, called various department heads into the conference room around lunchtime, about 12 o'clock, and said, we're hearing rumours that either the Queen is very ill or she might have already died. And we just want to make sure that we're all know exactly what we're doing, we're all up to speed. And as we were sort of having this meeting, someone from the political desk at Westminster phoned in to say that he'd just seen the Prime Minister being passed a note. And he thought that's what the note said, that exact thing, that the Queen was either very ill or had died. So we then sort of said, right, let's get as ready as we possibly can be. And then on the actual day, by about 3 o'clock, we had a very strong, if inadvertent, intimation that she had died when Hugh Edwards was presenting on BBC and had put his black tie on, which is what news presenters only do when a monarch has died. And he slightly jumped the gun because the official announcement didn't come till nearer 6 o'clock. But we sort of took that as a signal that he would have been briefed and that the BBC knew. And I think probably by then the editors, I think she died at about 3:30 in the afternoon. So I think the editor would have been told.
So what was it like for you? What was the atmosphere like in the newsroom? What was your role in what followed? I mean, what were you doing?
So we heard Nigel there say that, he was pulled in to the conference and it was all very exciting. I really didn't have anything to do with it because it was all prepared and ready to go. We just had to click publish. So I read through the obituary, but I didn't have a huge role, but I was privy to this incredibly somber, silent, reverent atmosphere, which for me was incredibly historic. And the strange thing about it is that I then left the office and I went to an Arcade Fire concert. And I remember arriving and my friends were like, the Queen died. What was that like? And suddenly I was like, God, it was like this. Yeah. And then the lead man of Arcade Fire, just before he came on, he's this Canadian guy. He sort of said, just want to have a moment for the Queen. And everyone kind of clapped. And I was like, this is so surreal. I've just been in the belly of the times, in the strange, reverent atmosphere, which I would add is part of the Times itself, because the Times is the paper of record. So
what do you mean by that? What does
I
that
mean that it is the oldest national newspaper in the UK. It was first founded in 1785, and particularly during the 19th century, it became a kind of unofficial arm of history. So momentous events would happen and it would be recorded in the Times. Even the word itself, the Times, holds us reverence. So the reason why I think the Queen's obituary in the Times was particularly important to get right, and the tone to get right, and we'll get onto the tone a little bit later on, is that the Times likes to see itself as still the paper of record. So the obituary itself had a reverent tone and a kind of solemnity. And within the Times offices, there was a sense that this was history waiting to happen.
You mentioned earlier that, you've been working on this the Times had been working on this obituary for decades. How much of the obituary was already written before the day came? I mean, what was any writing needed on the obituary, or was it basically ready to go and you just hit publish?
So the obituary itself was probably first written decades ago. I mean, around the time that she married Prince Philip.
Obviously, you don't start writing a 15,000 word obituary in 2 or 3 hours with 3 hours to go. You've got it pre-prepared, and that was probably one of the most prepared obituaries we've ever run. Initially, it would have gone through various iterations over the years, and we decided a few years before we actually ran that obituary that we needed to start again because it had got too sort of broken up, and there'd been so many different hands in it. So we got sort of one version as up to date as we could, and we were conscious of trying to fend off news editors who kept checking in and saying, have you included this? Have you included that? Because an obituary isn't a rolling news story. It's a sort of a standing back, sweeping account of a life that is going to be authoritative and be a sort of first draft of history.
The obituary itself has been updated over the years as soon as something momentous happens. But as Nigel said just then, there was a big change in recent years from what would have been a very dry record of history from the 30s and 40s. I mean, imagine when it was first written, it would have been a completely different story. It would have been a completely different style of writing. The obituary itself now it's focused on storytelling, and it's incredibly long. I mean, it's over 16,000 words, which I believe is the longest of any national newspaper.
15,000 words was very long for the modern era, as it were. But compared to the length of Queen Victoria's, it was a drop in the ocean. Queen Victoria's was 50,000 words long and run over several days in the paper, which rather suggests that the Victorians had a much better powers of concentration than modern readers do, and much more sort of powers of endurance. But we were sort of thinking 15,000 words. It was one of the longest we've run in the modern era, and it seemed about right because it was such a consequential life story to tell, really. It was an account of the whole second Elizabethan era.
Yeah, I like to think of it as a kind of play with different acts. When you read it, it's got the opening gambit. What did she mean to the world? What did she mean to history? It's got this great line where it says that she's both straddled history and made history. So looking back on her life is like looking back on a record of the most momentous events of the 20th century, which is why I think people are so emotional about her death, that she did represent what we now call as the Elizabethan era. She was a harbinger of hope for many people in the post-war years. And to many people, whether or not you agree with the very traditional values of the royal family that she represented, she did represent these values of duty and service and self-sacrifice, which is very anathema to some younger generations, but to particularly older generations, older Britons, depending on what side of the political, and I can see you smiling at me, but depending on what side of the political spectrum you land, she represented something old-fashioned about British values, whether or not they're still in vogue.
Well, it's funny because I remember I was in America when the Queen died, and I remember the Americans, because cards on the table, I find the monarchy incredibly boring.
Yeah,
Like, it's not. I'm not a strong anti-monarchist, or anti-royalist, or Republican. I find them deeply uninteresting. I think and it's something that I've always struggled with, like as a historian, because thankfully I'm a historian of the United States, so I haven't had to, reckon with.
Maybe that's why you're
Well,
American through and through.
Possibly, but actually, as I was reading through the Times obituary, I kind of had the realization that perhaps it's partly because it's always been Elizabeth II on the throne, who. And I don't think this is speaking out of line, but is quite a sort of
boring figure.
Well,
she's no, but
I don't want to
she.
say a boring figure, but sort of someone who floats above the level of interest.
But sorry, I think that's completely right, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, depending on the way you see it, because what our obituary really highlighted, and actually what every obituary highlighted, I had a read through the New York Times and the Telegraph and the Guardian, and of course every newspaper across the world ran the obituary. And if there was a central theme to every single one, it was this was a life selflessly dedicated to the duty of serving her country. She was a bastion of stability in a changing world, socially, economically, technologically. She was born during the general strike. That gives you an idea of how she started life then, lived through the Second World War, had to hide from the bombs. I mean, probably not literally hide from the bombs, but taken away from her home during the bombs. And she lived through the dawn of television, the dawn of the internet, of course, the many scandals that then beset the royal family that we will get onto. But there's a sense that she represents, perhaps it's boring, but a sense of real solidity and stability. And what people loved about her is that she was so devoted to her service and her duty. And as a person, you're not wrong when you say, you didn't say she was boring, you said that. So I won't put those words into your mouth, but she was shy, restrained, sometimes seen as cold and aloof. I mean, she was criticised for her relationship with Charles and then with Diana. When Princess Diana died, she famously held off from making a public statement on behalf of the crown for many days. And of course, Princess Diana was such an adored figure that she really, really came under scrutiny, perhaps for the first time in her career, for being cold and aloof and unfeeling. And Charles and her relationship was later revealed to be pretty cold. And these are one of the many ruptures that we see kind of breaking apart the myth of the royal family, which for many years, at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, was seen as this bastion of English wholesomeness. She was seen as the world's princess. She was seen as the sweet, angelic figure that represented Britain's best values. And that itself changed by the end of her reign, which is why I think you can look at her life, if you're a skeptic of what the royals represent, you can look at her life as charting this changing view of the royals and what they represent. In recent years, the various scandals that have beset the royal family has shown that it is perhaps not the bastion of traditional values that she perhaps represented.
So the Times is obviously, I think it's fair to say, an establishment newspaper. Presumably, the way the obituary was written reflected that sense of respect and reverence towards the Queen.
Yes, there was definitely a tone of reverence, but I'd just like to say before we get into the weeds of the obituary that other newspapers that weren't necessarily establishment, The Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they too had this tone of solemnity and gravity, because I do think that, as I said before, whether or not the tone is in favour of the monarchy and what she represented, there is a sense that the death of the Queen was a momentous event in the historical arc of the 20th century.
We were conscious as well that readers would be feeling very disconcerted by the news that the Queen had died, because she was a big part of everyone's life. And so we had to get the tone right, but we also had to make it a satisfying read. So it would have sort of anecdotes in it and be well constructed.
The tone was reverent. I mean, it was couched around this idea of her devoting herself to her duty. So it begins with the speech she made in 1947, where she says, "My whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." And it riffs on this idea that she selflessly dedicated her life to serving her country and her people. Now, despite that, what the obituary also tried to do, and this is what obituaries always try and do, and it's a harder job with the Queen because she had such a public facade, is get under her skin. And what I think is really interesting about this obituary is that every obituary tries to understand the human behind the myth, or just the human, what motivates us, what holds us back, our flaws. And with the Queen, that's difficult because, like any celebrity, she had a very carefully curated public persona. And she was so much a hallmark of the royal institution that it was difficult to see what lay beneath. But I think that we tried to do that. And I'd like to talk a bit about that now, because I spoke at the beginning about, her love of horses, her sort of slight humour. She, towards the end of her life, she agreed to take part in that stunt with James Bond. Do you remember that? For the opening of the 2012 Olympics, which I thought showed a sense of fun in her later years. But we also looked at what she was like as a person. When she was young, she was shy. She had an incredibly formal relationship with her parents, possibly a cold relationship with her parents, which was to be repeated to her own children. She was raised by a nanny, as you would expect. She was educated at home. When she was only 9 months old, the Duke and Duchess of York went on a tour of Australia and New Zealand that took them away for 6 months. I mean, imagine that being your parents. We see her as living in this gilded cage, and in many ways she was. She, of course, married Prince Philip quite young, and the obituary didn't shy away from the various difficulties of their marriage. Of course, they were famously very in love. It was a great love story, but he was a difficult man. I mean, he could be a domineering figure in their marriage. There's an anecdote about him saying something quite horrible to her, putting her down in her place. There were rumours of his affair, which were kept at bay by scrupulous newspaper heads.
Well, and actually, I mean, it's interesting. We've spoken before about the importance of euphemisms in obituaries. And I don't know if this counts as a euphemism, but I particularly enjoyed this bit of the obituary where they're talking about rumours of Philip's infidelity. And it sort of says, well, he would defend himself against charges of infidelity. There was no doubt that he enjoyed the company of close female friends. I did think that was a particularly well phrased bit.
I agree, and I think we're probably going to argue about this, but I think it's an appropriate phrase because this is a story. This is an obituary of her and her life. I don't think we need to be too graphic about the various affairs.
Well, I'd also presumably this is just because people don't know, or
people don't really know. And what I would say is, I think there's an interesting bit in the obituary about how it was somewhat difficult for him too, to be married to someone who then is suddenly thrust into the biggest limelight you could possibly ever imagine in the world, which is the Queen of England. So they're in Kenya and they find out that her father has died and she has been made queen. And, there's a sense with Philip that he felt in her shadow, particularly as, gender roles in this period, this is the 50s, 60s, were pretty formal, traditional. She's suddenly the most important woman in Britain. She has a massive sense of civic duty that he has to kind of fall in line with. He's somewhat in her shadow.
So earlier on, you described Elizabeth as a source of stability in changing times. Another way you could phrase that is that she is a conservative, right? I mean, she is someone who is rowing against the tide of history. Would that be a fair way to describe her? Or
Okay, this is a really fascinating question because on the one hand, I think she was a natural conservative. There was a natural conservatism to her. So she tended to go with the guidance of her advisors. She wasn't radical. She wasn't trying to shake things up. She was shy. She was restrained. She was formal. She wasn't particularly maternal, I think is the sense we get. She had this rigorous attention to detail. She made a point of reading thoroughly her government red boxes, and she would enjoy catching out ministers who would skimp out on the details, which presumably Boris Johnson and Liz trusted.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's this great bit in the Times obituary where of Harold Wilson being furious of him being caught out the first time he ever meets the Queen.
Yeah. So and, that is to say she has this natural conservatism, but I want to come back to your idea that she was going against the tide, because I think what she represented was an old-fashioned form of virtue, partly because of her upbringing, partly because of her position and her role as being the Queen. I mean, being the Queen and being a royal is in itself very conservative. But I don't know if I would agree that she was going against the flow of the tide, because during her life, things changed rapidly. And in my view, and in I think the obituaries view, she kept up with that. So of course, one of the biggest changes in her monarchy, which I think she dealt with, we might argue about this, but with grace in the only way she could, was the crumbling of the British Empire. When she ascended the throne, the British Empire was somewhat intact, though on its way out. And by the end, it had completely disintegrated. In her Christmas broadcast in 1953, she stated, "The Commonwealth," so she changed it from the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations, "bears no resemblance to the empires of the past. It is an entirely new conception built on the highest qualities of the spirit of man. To that new conception of an equal partnership of nations and races, I shall give myself heart and soul." So I think there's a debate here to be had about, the fading authority of the British Empire worldwide.
Yeah, I mean, there's this line in the Times obituary which said that her life both straddled history and made history. And I don't think anyone would quibble with the first part of that, that it straddled history. I suppose that the more interesting thing is the extent to which she made history, or whether history was something that happened to her.
That's really
Because
interesting.
in a sense, if she is a conservative living through times that are no way conservative, it often does feel like history is happening around her. I mean, so one of the examples is that, which we mentioned a bit earlier, is the televised coronation, which I didn't realise until reading the Times obituary that she didn't really want to do at all. And actually, it was only after public outcry that she was sort of forced into a compromise and allowed it to be televised. So I do think that there are times when it feels like history is happening to her and she is catching up with that history.
I think that's completely right. And I think there is a sense that she sometimes doesn't make the right decisions for the modern world, and she sort of has to, as you say, catch up. And I'm thinking of Princess Diana there. Many thought that the Queen had really misplayed that, miscalculated that. There's a sense, as you say, that she didn't quite do the right thing. But I would argue that when historians look back on her life, she really does straddle this time when the monarchy meant something and perhaps did make history, and this time when the monarchy is fading from people's imagination and view, or what it represents is fading. We now are kind of interrogating the values of the royal family in a way that never happened when she ascended to the throne. When she ascended to the throne, people automatically respected her. And that was probably the biggest change in her life, I think.
But presumably a lot of that is to do both with the sort of changing nature of the times, but also with the sort of cluster of events that happened towards the end of her reign. And I'm thinking here particularly around Prince Andrew and his various scandals. Scandals feels like too lesser a phrase for that. And then Meghan Markle and Prince Harry as well. How do you think she handled those two scandals?
I mean, I think the Times obituary mentioned it, but briefly. And we spoke before this episode about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. The New York Times, interestingly, went much further into that scandal, particularly around the Oprah Winfrey show, when Meghan suggested that a member of the royal family had been racist towards her child, and that she had thought of suicide because she'd felt isolated within the royal family, which of course echoes Princess Diana. So I'm not sure we went into huge detail about that, and I personally think that was it a huge part of her life? I would say, I mean, you mentioned earlier that history happened to her, not because of her. I think that on the one hand, perhaps Meghan was made to feel, as Princess Diana had, isolated from this quite anachronistic family. I think there's a sense that these women come into this family that has its kind of cold aloofness and detachment, and they feel isolated, and I have huge sympathy for that. And maybe that is an important part of the Queen's story. In my view, her story happens long before. I mean, this is in the absolute twilight years, and I don't know, I feel like that deserves, as the Prince Andrew thing does, you know, that deserves kind of a brief mention. But you don't agree with that, so...
Well, I certainly don't agree with the Prince Andrew having only a brief mention.
Well, what do you think? Okay, so what do you think it should...
Well, I think that, as you said, she spent her life representing this institution of monarchy. And over the last couple of years, that institution, I think rightly, has been brought into crisis by the behaviour of Prince Andrew. Because I think it reflects what many people see as all of the problems of that class.
No, I agree with that. But how do we separate that from an obituary of someone's life? I mean, like, it's like saying, I know that she represents the royal family, and therefore...
Because it's if we're thinking about the history of the monarchy in Britain, which her life is obviously a part of, this is one of the great sources of crisis of the monarchy today, is the behaviour of someone like Prince Andrew.
No, I agree, but what I'm saying is that I think an obituary is and should be a record of someone's life, where they were born, what motivated them, their flaws, of course their flaws, and we've spoken about her flaws. I mean, she wasn't particularly maternal. We spoke about her relationship with Charles being strained, but with Diana being strained. I think that the scandals around, and again, scandals is a soft word, but everything that happened with Prince Andrew and his disastrous interview, I mean, yes, that had a lot to do with the royal family itself, of course, and also probably her relationship with Prince Andrew, which I'm sure was difficult. And I'm sure that he was a product of this very strange ecosystem that the royal family is. But in my view, that's not an obituary. You know, we don't need to go into detail about, I mean, that doesn't reflect on her life, I don't think. I think that reflects on the changing nature of the royal institution and Prince Andrew as a person. But I'm not sure the interview had anything to do with her. I'm not sure that the backlash had much to do with her. I think what a lot of people would say, and this is possibly the more royalist view of it, is that these things happened around her in the twilight years of her life, and it wasn't fair on her.
Well, yeah, to be absolutely clear, I'm not in any way, assigning any kind of blame. I mean, it's more that this institution that she has spent her entire life serving with grace and dignity is then brought into disrepute.
No, I agree with that.
By the behaviour of one of her sons.
The curious thing about her obituary is it does represent a moment in history. It's a snapshot. It's a moment in time, the first draft of history. And I think if an obituary was something that evolved, as it could do digitally, but you don't do that because you have to remember that the moment there's a cutoff point, and you can't keep revisiting the words digitally and sort of amending them. You have to sort of accept that that's the final version. And I think, to our credit, it's not an obvious comparison, but when Jimmy Savile died, the news of his crimes did not come to light until a year after his death. So his Times obituary was actually quite celebratory, and it went in on his sort of charitable work and what a colourful, eccentric character he was. And we haven't gone back and amended it. I think that's the right thing to do, because it is an important historical document about what people thought at the time. And I think the same applies to the Queen. I mean, she was so revered that there was, certainly at the time, there would have been no questioning about the way she conducted her life and her sense of duty and responsibility. But there have been one or two questions lately about her, the way she handled Prince Andrew and indulged him to an extent. Did she slightly get that wrong? And history will have to be the judge. But you wouldn't go back and sort of, modify the obituary to reflect that. You have to accept that that's what was thought at that moment in time.
That's really interesting, because I'm so conflicted about that, because obviously part of you thinks, well, obviously you need to go and change that. This is the paper record. You have to update the record. But then at the same time, there is something I quite like. There is some sense of accountability in that, where the prevailing view of that time is frozen in time.
Yeah.
As a reminder, perhaps, of the blind spots of society around an individual. I quite like the fact that people aren't going back and correcting it. But that's such a fascinating... I didn't know that obituary stands like that.
It's really fascinating. And I think that when I first heard that we hadn't changed the Jimmy Savile obit, my sort of Gen Z hackles were up, and I was thinking, well, bloody hell, we have to go back and say that he was a paedophile. Da, da, da. Actually, I think there's some truth to, as you say, freezing it within the prevailing view of its time. And with the Queen...
So I've now done that classic thing where I've had my view spoken back to me, and I'm sort of...
you don't agree with it?
Well, I suppose... Okay, what's interesting is that, in the days of print journalism, maybe that makes more sense, because you would have to publish a correction later on. There's something about, in the age of the internet, where someone is going to Google someone's name,
and there's
maybe
a record
in 50 years' time, and there's a record of it. That would feel really weird if you read an obituary of Jimmy Savile and that there was no reference to that.
I know, but I guess you'd be changing the whole bent of the obit, yeah.
So obviously, I remember when the day when the Queen died. I'd said I was in America, but I was watching lots of the coverage on the BBC, etc. And a lot of the memorialization took place on television, right? I mean, there was news anchors, there was interviews, there were people were on YouTube, people on Twitter, people. That's where a lot of the commemoration took place. So, what do you think the role of the obituary that the Times wrote, which is obviously, as you said, very long piece of work? What do you think the role of that was in the process of remembering the Queen?
So there are two things here. More generally, so I'm going to talk about generally the role of obituaries and also about the Queen in particular, because in general, I think obituaries commemorate, memorialise people in an entirely different way to social media tributes, to TV snapshots, to news anchors. Because I think they're the closest you come to a kind of well-written novelistic biography in memorial form. When you have a news anchor, it's factual, it's the Queen has died. You have social media tributes, they're often very one-sided, they're not objective, they're kind of slightly boring, they're from people who knew her, which I don't think an obituary should ever be written in that way. And then you have TV reels, you have sort of videos, which can be really great because you have the visual element, right, which obituaries don't have. But I think the obituary is the only form of memorializing where you feel instinctively, gutturally, in your belly, what she represented, who she was, as far as we can with the Queen, of course. I think, especially with this obituary, because it's so long, you come away from it feeling, personally, I felt kind of emotional, I felt the gravity of it, I felt what she represented, as I said, the social and political forces around her, the anecdotes that brought her to life in a way that you don't. Now, more specifically with the Queen, and I think the same with someone like David Attenborough, these great mammoth figures, there's a sense that the tone of the obituary was so in keeping with what she represented. And by that, I mean that it was almost formal in tone. It was, as I said in the beginning, the idea about her being a woman, a wife, a mother, that there's a kind of gravity to those words which does do justice to the gravity of the memory of her in so many people's imaginations, whether or not you agree with what she represented. So that is when it's a very, very particular, unique obituary, because I truly think that it is the absolute apex of the obituarist's power.
What tends to happen in newspaper offices on big occasions is it's sort of your job, so you've got to be professional about it, and there's no time for sentiment. But this was something that we all knew and had sort of personal feelings about, and she was a big part of everyone's lives and a big part of the national story. And so this sort of sense of, beyond the professional sort of reaction to this news event, there was a sense of it's finally happened. You know, it was like the matriarch has gone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Last Rites. Join us next week where we'll explore another fascinating life.